Yeah everybody, this is TezMechNator and this is the Crash Bandicoot Retrospective. In 1996, Crash Bandicoot was released on the Sony PlayStation 1. It was developed by Naughty Dog and produced by Universal Pictures. And as we already know, that Crash Bandicoot became one of the most significant icons in the late 90s, and this is the journey it took. We set the clocks back to 1985, where Andy Gavin, who would become the video game director, and Jason Rubin, who would become a programmer, thought that they could make money through developing games, and they created their own independent software company called Jam Software. No, that's the wrong type of jam. On the second year of its existence, they created two games called Math Jam and Sky Crazed for the Apple II consoles, which was one of Apple's famous computers at the time. It was in 1988 where Jam Software put their sticker on the globe by releasing DreamZone, that was a platformer, which is Andy and Jason's favourite genre of games. The game itself had a fantasy setting where the player has to escape from this nightmarish world. All the reviewers gave it a very critical good reception, and it received 5 out of 5 stars from one critic, which makes it a badass game. In 1989, Naughty Dog was the new name for Jam Software, and problem is though, Naughty Dog had a little bit of a tarnish on itself. What happened was that in 1991, The Rings of Power was released on the Sega Genesis and the Mega Drive. It was a PC role-playing game that had many characters, different outcomes, and it was very open-ended. And unfortunately, the critics didn't buy into it, and they gave it a 1 star at least. And as a result of this, EA, the producer that was funding this game, didn't approve of this, and they didn't trust Naughty Dog anymore, which was very bad. But after this though, both Andy and Jason found the producer that they wanted, Universal Pictures. They released The Way of the Warrior in 1994, which was a fighting game that was quote unquote a clone of Mortal Kombat. Although this game received very negative reviews, it did outsell Samurai Showdown, and it encouraged Universal Pictures to let Naughty Dog sign a dotted contract to allow them to produce 3 more games. As an interesting trivia, both Andy Gavin and Jason provided voiceovers for the characters like Cordy the Spoiler and Koatori. However though, due to the development costing so much, Naughty Dog had to file bankruptcy, but moving to Los Angeles saved them from that situation and enabled them to produce more games. The next thing that the pair did was studied arcade games, and they realised that platform and adventure, their favourite genre of games, hasn't made the transition to 3D rendering. So this naturally in turn led them to produce a 3D game that was very similar to Sonic the Hedgehog and Mario, but there was one problem. The market of the time was predominantly dominated by a plumber and a blue hedgehog. Due to the fact that this type of game would be equivalent to a 3D Sonic game, they nicknamed it the Sonic Ass game. And this type of idea actually got approved by Universal Pictures producers such as Mark Haney. With the approval ticked, there was another problem. Where is it going to be available? And unfortunately for the time, the console range had bad records of sales and weren't sophisticated enough, such as the Sega Saturn, so they opted to the sexiest option there is, no not that type of sexy, which was the new and highly anticipated PlayStation 1. With the decision finalised, they had to meet with Sony Entertainment to sign the contract, which meant that Naughty Dog had to pay a whopping $35,000 for the Sony development unit. With pretty much everything ticked off, they had to think of a character, and the question was, who was it going to be? Well, they intended to have a character that was an animal but had human traits, and the range of animals that were chosen were bandicoots, wombats and potoroos. And here's a fun fact for you. At the development stage, they chose the dorkiest names for the character. It was Willy the Wombat, Wes, Russell's or Dizzy. And just imagine if they came up with Dizzy the Wombat. To make the character more effective, charming and less lame, the developers decided to not use a voice actor for the character and keeping it as a moot. But obviously, where there's a great hero, there must be a great villain, and they decided who was going to be the villain. They based the villain on the Brain, who appeared in Pinky and the Brain, and this was the idea. It was Cortex, a very mad scientist who boss around these minions around and creates creatures for world domination. And in order to compete with Dr. Eggman, aka Robotnik or whatever you call him, they put a unique symbol on his head, which was the letter N. With all the decision making of the characters and the game itself, it was designing them that was the problem. In order to help Naughty Dog develop this unique character, they hired Charles Simbilis and Joe Pearson. I haven't got a picture of them, but this will do. As it was decided that a Tasmanian would be part of the game, the designers were required to create cool looking characters and 3 islands that were very mysterious and had many environments as possible. Then we entered the production part of the stage. In order to make the game look organic to the player, the computer designers were forbidden to create 90-degree corners and straight lines. And here's the interesting part, the PlayStation pixel dimension influenced the programmers and the development team to use shaded characters rather than textural ones. And whilst designing the levels, the developers had to squint their eyes in order to get the right balance of contrast and brightness. And here is one bit of the trivia. They had to use textures for the levels in order to make detailed ones and make the game look very visually pleasing. However, when they pitched the game to Universal Studios, they were criticised for the animation flow, which wasn't very smooth. So in order to prevent this from happening in the future, they invented a new programming language, which Andy Gavin and Dave Beckett produced. It was called the Game Oriented Object. However, though, there was one tinsy-lintsy problem. The game was almost jeopardised by having one of the producers at Universal Studios insisting that the character should be named either Wes, Russell, Willy the Wombat or Ossie the Oxtail. With their boxing match over, they decided to display the game on E3 1996, and it received a lot of praises for its gameplay and graphics. In early parts of 1996, 2 prototypes were released. The first one featured 5 levels that weren't featured in the final game. You had Lava Cave that was inaccessible, Brio was undefeatable, and there was one stage where it featured a waterfall where you had to ascend it, go on the collapsible platforms, and there was one enemy called the Dingo that can even kill you. The most famous cutout level was the Climb and Ascent. Just imagine Slippery Climb
×2.
That's how hard it was. The second prototype was well known for being hard and having beta levels. To this day, it's been debated that Sunset Vista is the hardest level. It also had Whole Hog with new features such as boomerang swinging, and it became very hard. With everything done and completed, checkmate. The game was released in the 28th of August 1996 in North America, whilst in Europe in the 2nd of November 1996. When the player starts the game, Crash Bandicoot ends up in Insanity Island where the player has to go through a 3-dimensional path. There are 8 possible moves that the player can make, well I could say 4 in a way because you only can move at 90 degrees, and they're simple controls, well they're actually tricky believe it or not, where X to jump and square to attack. And obviously with every game you have to go from point A to point B whilst not getting killed, and you have to slaughter enemies whilst you're on your way. You can generate lives by collecting 100 apples, and when you destroy 3 Uku Akumas or Aka Akumas, I don't know which one it is, you become invisible. You can destroy enemies, destroy boxes like a bitch, and you can finish the levels that way. And this is the frustrating bit of the game. If you, let's say, die or get killed, guess what? You're not entitled to get the diamond. And this is really frustrating. And particularly in the later levels of the game, there's some of them where you can't even get the gem because you have to go and get the coloured gem itself. For example, if you're in Jungle Village, you have to get to Lost City to get to that part of the level. However, though, I don't want to dampen the spirit because I want to enjoy myself. And there's one thing I admire Crash Bandicoot for, it's its soundtrack and its environment. For example, Castle Machinery has a really good soundtrack that relates to the objects such as the robots, and it becomes really interesting. When you finish the levels that incorporate 2D elements, for example the Great Wall, levels that feature boulders that was based on the infamous scene in Indiana Jones, and the levels with the Warhog. What the fuck? What's that smile? God, that's really creepy. I've also forgotten one thing. Those creative bosses. Unlike Fatty Robotnik, you have to find creative ways of defeating them. For example, in Papu Papu, you got to jump on his head. And Whippoorwish, well, that's really entertaining because you got to time everything right, be patient, and he's got a weird sound. And Pinstripe, which is my favourite, and you got the Brio stage, which was originally undefeatable. And as soon as you finish all the levels and the bosses, you got one person that's ahead of you, the spooky villain known as Cortex, and you beat him as if he's nobody's business, and then you save your girlfriend Katrana, who's based on Pamela Anderson, and you go along the sunset. And if you're not satisfied with the outcome, you can collect all the coloured gems and the normal gems in order to unlock the certain area in the Great Hall. What you do is that once you complete it, you need to go along the gem path, and you eventually go to a balcony where you see Trina with a giant bird. Massive bird. And you leave the Cortex Island where you see a little trivia about the bosses. With the game being talked about, let's talk about the aftermath. According to sources, 6.8 million people have purchased the game as of 2003 and have downloaded it 500,000 times in PSN. The fantastic game received very positive reviews on its graphics, unique animation and gameplay elements, but received very harsh criticism about the camera, and I can explain why. Having a character that's moving only on 90 degrees whilst the environments were moving at 75 degrees strain the eyes. A good example of this is when you play Cortex's power. It looks as if you're playing Sonic the Hedgehog but in his ass game view, and it's really horrible on the eyes because you have to time everything right and make sure everything's not deceiving you. Because of this success, Naughty Dog was required to produce a sequel that was more imaginative and would allow the Sony PlayStation to compete with the Nintendo 64. On the last note, I would have to say thank you for watching, please subscribe, Write in the comments below to give me some feedback so that I can improve the product, and yeah, share with your friends, it's free. The next retrospective will be Metal Gear Solid. The next part of this retrospective will come in 2 weeks time, and please visit my social media pages for updates.